The Threxian Ravager was a name whispered in fear across the galaxy. A creature of legend, with towering height, black scales like iron, and claws that could shred even the toughest of alloys. Its intelligence was unparalleled, able to sense its prey's every move before they could make it. Many species had tried, and failed, to defeat it. It was a predator born to rule, feared and avoided by every race in the universe. When the Ravager's ship entered the atmosphere of the remote human colony, it sent a shockwave through the Terran Federation. The small outpost, situated on the fringes of the known galaxy, was known for its mining operations, thriving off the rich resources of a planet most other species didn't care for. The population was small, mostly farmers, miners, and a few engineers. But the Federation, in its infinite optimism, believed the humans could handle anything until now. Commander Vega, the colony's leader, had never faced an enemy like this. The best they had were defense drones, automated turrets, and an old fleet of ships that couldn't even reach the colony in time. Vega had seen battles before, but this was different. The Ravager landed with the power of a crashing star. With every step, the earth trembled, and the wind howled in terror. The creature moved effortlessly, its terrifying form cutting through the landscape like a hot knife through butter. In a matter of hours, it was already laying waste to everything the colony had spent decades building. The first wave of defense came in the form of drones, sleek and fast, equipped with plasma weapons and high-caliber rifles. They locked onto the Ravager's immense form and fired in unison, but it was no use. The Ravager's tough hide absorbed the blasts without even a flinch. It swiped its claws through the air, and in an instant, half of the drones were reduced to twisted scraps of metal. Next came the turrets, automated sentries that had been designed to deal with hostile creatures of the local fauna. But the Ravager wasn't a beast of this world. It dodged every blast with ease, its massive frame moving with unnatural speed. With a single roar, it destroyed the turrets, sending sparks and debris scattering in every direction. The people of the colony were horrified. They had always heard the stories about the Ravager, but never had they thought they would face it. Some tried to run, others hid in shelters, and a few brave souls tried to fight. But all of them shared one common thought: they were no match for the creature that now loomed over them. As Vega watched from the command center, her mind raced. They needed to come up with a plan, something to stop the Ravager before it destroyed everything they had. But how? Their weapons were useless, and the creature seemed to anticipate every move they made. It wasn't just the Ravager's power that terrified them, it was its intelligence. Unlike most predators, it didn't rely on pure brute force alone. It analyzed, predicted, and outsmarted every move they made. The humans had never faced an enemy like this before. No one had. It was a beast from a nightmare, and they were trapped in its jaws. Vega's hands shook as she contacted the Federation for help, but deep down, she knew that no fleet would arrive in time. The Ravager was too fast, too deadly. And in the back of her mind, a creeping doubt began to settle. Could humanity survive this? But it wasn't just the soldiers and scientists who were watching the destruction unfold. In the shadow of the chaos, one lone man sat at the power grid station, unaware of the scale of the disaster unfolding above. He wasn't a soldier or an officer. He wasn't even a scientist. He was just Joe, a maintenance worker with a knack for solving problems no one else could. As the Ravager's rampage continued, Joe noticed something. The power grid hummed differently today, buzzing with an odd frequency. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it caught his attention. The Ravager was close now, but Joe wasn't looking at the beast. He was focused on the grid. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the power system might hold the key to stopping the monster. He didn't know how, but he was certain of one thing: if there was a chance to fight back, it lay in that humming energy. For the first time since the Ravager arrived, Joe allowed himself to hope. He didn't know if it would work, but he had to try. The Ravager's rampage continued with unstoppable ferocity. Every attempt to contain it was futile. The colony's defense systems were designed to repel invaders, but not something of this magnitude. Drones, lasers, and turrets all proved useless. The Ravager, with its immense strength and brutal intelligence, dismantled each defense as if it were nothing more than a toy. Every shot fired, every trap set, only enraged the beast further. Commander Vega watched helplessly as the beast tore through the outer walls of the colony, its claws slicing through steel like butter. The sight was enough to make even the toughest of soldiers falter. The screams of civilians echoed through the communication channels as they scrambled to find shelter. Vega's mind raced, but there was no strategy that could work against a creature like this. She had seen death before, but nothing like this. This wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The people in the underground bunkers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. The Ravager had already made its way through half of the colony, and no one was safe. Children clung to their parents, the elderly prayed in whispered voices, and soldiers readied their weapons, though they knew it was all in vain. The Ravager was a force of nature, and no one was prepared for it. Desperation set in. Vega ordered a last-ditch attempt to stop the creature. She ordered the deployment of a set of high-tech energy nets, designed to trap and immobilize large creatures. They had been used on local wildlife before, but they had never encountered anything like the Ravager. Still, it was all they had left. The nets were launched from the remaining drones, each one humming with the promise of a final stand. The Ravager paused for a moment, seeming to study the nets as they descended. Then, with a swift movement, it swiped one out of the air, tearing it apart as though it were made of paper. It roared, its voice shaking the ground beneath their feet. The nets, one by one, were destroyed. The creature seemed to almost enjoy the futility of their efforts, as if mocking them for even trying. Vega's heart sank. There was no way to fight this thing head-on. She knew it. The soldiers knew it. Everyone knew it. The Ravager was too powerful, too intelligent. And as the last of their defenses crumbled, she realized the truth. They had no hope. No reinforcements were coming. No miracle was going to save them. This was the end. In the distance, the Ravager moved toward the last bastion of the colony's remaining forces, its eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. There was no escape. They would die here, at the mercy of this godlike beast. Vega's voice faltered as she issued the order to evacuate the remaining civilians to the underground bunkers, but even that felt pointless. There was no way they could outrun the Ravager. It would find them, and it would destroy them, just as it had done with everything else. The battle was over. The colony was doomed. All that was left was to face the inevitable. But even in the face of extinction, something inside Vega refused to give up. She wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. But as she watched the Ravager approach, she knew it was only a matter of time before the end came. The creature was unstoppable, and the humans were powerless to stop it. It was the cruelest of ironies. A species that had conquered space, had built cities on distant worlds, and had survived countless threats across the stars, now faced extinction at the hands of a single creature. But there was one thing the Ravager didn't understand. It didn't understand humans. It didn't understand the strength they found when all seemed lost. It didn't know that, even in their darkest hour, the humans would find a way to fight back even if that fight seemed hopeless. There was one more card to play. But first, they had to survive long enough to play it. In the midst of the chaos, amidst the smoke and the crumbling ruins, one figure stood apart from the rest. Joe, a simple maintenance worker, had been observing the Ravager's onslaught from a forgotten corner of the colony's power grid station. While everyone else was scrambling to survive or plan their last stand, Joe's mind was focused on something different: the grid. The humming sound of the energy system had caught his attention long before the Ravager had appeared. The power fluctuations were subtle, but to Joe, they were glaringly obvious. As the Ravager wreaked havoc, Joe's thoughts raced. The grid wasn't just a source of power, it was more than that. It wasn't until the third wave of defense failed that it hit him. The Ravager wasn't just immune to physical damage. It was operating on a different wavelength entirely. Its ability to dodge every shot, its incredible intelligence, and its near-telepathic precision weren't random. The creature's movements seemed to be perfectly synchronized with the energy output of the grid, as though it were somehow tuned to it. A deep, instinctive understanding of the frequencies that governed the planet's systems. Joe wasn't a soldier. He didn't have the weapons, the training, or the strategy to confront such a creature head-on. But he had something that the others didn't: a deep, intimate understanding of how things worked on a technical level. He knew that the Ravager was being guided by something more than instinct. It was as if the creature had found a way to sync its own neural impulses with the planet's energy patterns. The idea formed in his mind quickly. He couldn't just try to fight the Ravager the way everyone else had. That approach had already failed. What he needed was a disruption, something that would throw off the beast's senses, confuse its pattern recognition, and sever its connection to the grid. But how? Joe's eyes darted around the power station, scanning for anything he could use. Then, he saw it: an old, discarded capacitor, something that would normally be used to store massive amounts of electrical energy for backup purposes. It wasn't the most sophisticated piece of tech, but it was powerful, and more importantly, it could be reworked into something else. Joe didn't have the luxury of time. The Ravager was already moving closer to the grid, and it would soon be within range of the central control hub. With urgency fueling every motion, Joe tore the capacitor apart, rigging together a makeshift energy emitter. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The idea was simple: emit a pulse that would disrupt the frequency the Ravager had tuned into. A massive burst of energy that could jolt the creature's nervous system into confusion. Joe wasn't sure it would work, but he had no other options. The grid was the only weapon they had left, and if it was going to work, he had to use it now. As the Ravager neared the central station, its massive form looming like a shadow, Joe positioned himself just outside its path. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands shook, but his mind was calm. He activated the capacitor. A pulse of energy erupted from the emitter, sending a shockwave through the air. The Ravager paused mid-step, its head snapping toward Joe with a predatory snarl. For a moment, it hesitated, confused by the unexpected interference. Joe stepped forward, focusing all his energy on the emitter. He needed the Ravager to feel the full brunt of the disruption, to realize that the pulse was coming from him. The creature's telepathic abilities were thrown into disarray as it struggled to process the new frequency bombarding its mind. Joe's pulse quickened as he realized the beast was disoriented, and that was his moment. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, he moved closer, positioning himself directly in front of the Ravager. His thoughts raced. The creature, now completely thrown off, was vulnerable. Joe had no weapons, no armor, no training, just a simple plan. He didn't know if it would work, but in that moment, he did the only thing he could think to do. Without warning, he slapped the Ravager across the snout. It wasn't a powerful strike, not by any means. It wasn't meant to hurt the creature. But the force of the pulse, combined with the physical shock, seemed to overload the Ravager's neural system. The beast's massive frame stiffened, its glowing eyes flickering before it collapsed to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent. Joe stood there, panting, unsure of what had just happened. Had it worked? Did he just take down the most dangerous predator in the galaxy with a slap? The Ravager's enormous body twitched once, twice. Then, it went still. The beast, the legendary killer that had ravaged colonies for centuries, was incapacitated. It was down, brought to its knees by a human and a slap. Joe stood motionless, eyes wide with disbelief. He had done it. Against all odds, against all reason, he had somehow managed to stop the creature. It wasn't brute force, it wasn't military strategy, it was something else. It was human ingenuity. And in that moment, Joe realized that it wasn't the technology, the weapons, or the power that mattered. It was the ability to think differently, to see things in a way no one else could. That was humanity's true strength. The silence that followed was deafening. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, no one dared to believe it. The Ravager, the unstoppable force that had terrorized the galaxy, was lying motionless on the ground. The beast's massive form twitched once, its eyes flickering with the faintest sign of life, but it was over. The colony, which had moments before been on the brink of annihilation, was now safe. It was an impossible outcome, and yet it had happened. As the initial shock began to wear off, the people of the colony slowly emerged from their hiding places. They had been through hell, and the thought that they had somehow survived seemed unreal. Commander Vega stood at the front, staring at the Ravager, her mind still trying to process the scene before her. The battle had been lost. They had been moments from certain death. And then, out of nowhere, one-manned Joe, the maintenance worker, had turned the tide with nothing more than a slap. The colony's engineers and scientists quickly moved in to examine the beast, still unsure whether it was truly incapacitated or merely playing possum. Joe was quickly surrounded by a group of civilians, their faces filled with awe and gratitude. He was a hero, in every sense of the word, yet he seemed completely unaffected. It wasn't much, he muttered, brushing off the attention as though it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. To Joe, it had just been a job, a quick fix. But to everyone else, it was a miracle. Vega approached him, still incredulous. "Joe, do you have any idea what you just did?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Joe shrugged, his eyes scanning the ground, clearly not one for speeches or heroics. I noticed a thing with the grid. The creature, it was keyed into the frequency. The slap was just a way to amplify the disruption, he said, his voice casual as if he had just completed a routine task. But that's when it hit Vega. What Joe had done wasn't just instinct or luck. He had used his knowledge, his understanding of the system, to create something the Ravager couldn't process. No weapon had ever worked. But human ingenuity, human unpredictability, had. Word of the Ravager's defeat spread quickly. News broadcasts from the Federation picked up the story, and before long, people from all corners of the galaxy were talking about the human colony that had stood against the most dangerous predator the universe had ever known. The phrase "slap it like a human" became an instant saying, a symbol of the unexpected triumph of human will over brute strength. The victory didn't just belong to Joe, though. It belonged to every person who had refused to give up. The miners, the engineers, the civilians, all of them had seen their world nearly crumble, yet they had persevered. Even when their weapons failed, even when all seemed lost, they had stood together. The Ravager, in all its power, had underestimated the one thing it couldn't predict, the human spirit. Scientists began to study the Ravager's collapse, trying to understand the effects of the pulse. The data they gathered was astounding. It turned out that the frequency Joe had tapped into wasn't just a fluke. It was an area of the planet's energy systems that had gone largely unnoticed, and when amplified, it had created a neural disruption in the Ravager's brain. No other species had ever thought to exploit the natural energy flow of a planet in this way. It was a revelation, one that would change how they fought future battles. But it wasn't just the technology or the discovery that made the difference. It was the willingness to try something no one else would. That was humanity's real advantage. As the dust settled, Vega couldn't help but reflect on the broader lesson. The galaxy had always looked down on humanity as a fledgling species, unrefined, untamed, and primitive. But time and time again, humans had proven that they were capable of the impossible. They fought not just with weapons, but with creativity, with an unshakable belief that even when faced with the darkest odds, they would find a way. Joe's simple act of slapping a predator to death had shown the galaxy what humans were truly capable of. It wasn't the force or the might that made them strong. It was the willingness to innovate, to face the unimaginable, and to never accept defeat. And as Vega looked out at the colony, now beginning to rebuild, she knew this victory would not just be remembered as a story of survival, but as a testament to the fact that, when the universe believed humanity was outmatched, it had underestimated one simple truth: humans never give up.